Hello, my name is Malcolm Lett. I have a background in computer science and AI, and I've been researching consciousness as a hobby for the last decade. I'm fascinated by the challenge to traditional science that there might be boundaries to how much of consciousness that it can explain. I've always felt that traditional science can explain more than we think, so I'm interested in exploring how far we can push those boundaries. To that end, today I'm going to present a brief summary of a novel theory of consciousness that I call the meta-management theory of consciousness. The meta-management theory of consciousness, or MMT for short, is a computational theory that focuses on the need for self-management of cognitive processes during deliberation. I argue that this self-management leads to the very characteristics that we call consciousness. In that way, it provides a theory of the functional purpose of consciousness, including why it should have evolved at all. It provides a foundation for theories of high-level intelligence. MMT bears similarities to existing computational theories like global workspace theory, attention schema theory, and higher-order thought. However, I believe it is unique in the detail and clarity that it offers. And it is also unique in establishing first principles for high-level intelligence and showing clearly how that relates to consciousness. In the end, I think that MMT provides the much-needed missing low-level context to those existing theories. Now, it's not a new idea that some form of meta-processing of cognitive abilities might be required for intelligence, or that such meta-processes might be related to consciousness. Separate works by Aaron Sloman and Robert Walensky in the 70s and 80s alluded to this very idea. Later work by Aaron Sloman and his student Luc Baudouin elaborated on this to some extent, but the ideas have been largely ignored with the recent advances in deep learning. The research field of metacognition is full of discussions of how metacognition might be related to consciousness, but it tends to be more focused on the high-level executive control aspects of human intelligence without examining the low-level mechanisms. So to date, there doesn't appear to be any other work that gets into the low-level details of how these metacognitive processes might tie together intelligence and consciousness. This is a lost opportunity, in my opinion, and where I have focused. Like many other computational theories of consciousness, MMT is really a theory of intelligence that happens to explain consciousness. So allow me to take a little bit of a circuitous route in explaining that intelligence side of the theory first, and then I'll bring the discussion back to consciousness. Let's start with deliberation. The simplest organisms just react to their environment. Importantly, that reaction is more or less immediate. Whatever response that they're going to produce, they produce it almost immediately upon a given sensory stimulus. The more complex organisms have an additional ability to deliberate. Put simply, deliberation is repeated cycles of cognitive processing, further revising some initial idea for an arbitrary amount of time without producing an action that interacts with the environment. In humans, we call this thinking. But there's a particular problem with deliberation that I shall illustrate with a maze. When navigating the environment, the individual must observe the shape of the environment to determine the best trajectory to take to get from their starting position to some goal. They must avoid obstacles such as walls, and they must avoid dangers that might harm them. Deliberation is similar. During deliberation, the state of the cognitive system itself moves through a cognitive state space. For example, the cognitive state at any given time might be identified by the individual's current partial decision and what it plans to consider next. Navigation through cognitive state space also faces similar problems to those faced by navigation through physical space. For example, there are optimum and suboptimum trajectories. Importantly, during the deliberation, the individual has no feedback from the environment as to the value of its current cognitive trajectory. Simply preferring to minimize deliberation time is not a sufficient strategy to support the variety of different kinds of problems that may arise. Cognitive state space must be wrapped in some way that is similar to how we map our must be mapped, in some way that is similar to how we map our physical environment. But state space is not Euclidean, so it is perhaps even more complex than navigation through physical space. There are also regions of cognitive state space that need to be avoided. We've all experienced the way that our minds will sometimes repeatedly return to old frustrations, leaving us stuck pointlessly mulling the same thing over and over, like some sort of gravity well. Work by Luc Baudouin has identified several other problems. Returning to the problem of navigation through physical space, what we have is a body and its state, and a first order control process that monitors and manages that body state through the generation of body actions. In the case of navigation through cognitive space, we have a second order equivalent, with a meta management process monitoring and managing the first order control process. It does this through observing the state and behavior of that first order process and by applying some sort of metacognitive actions against it. This is the definition of meta management that I use here. And I suggest that the brain employs a meta management mechanism for the management of its deliberative processing. But how? The most obvious first guess would be a separate meta management system, perhaps a separate region of the brain, illustrated on the bottom left here. But this has a number of problems. How much of the state of the first order process does the meta management process need access to? To observe all first order state, it might perhaps need to monitor every single neuron. This leads to tremendous wiring complexity, to a meta management process that is probably the same size or even bigger than the rest of the brain, and in the most extreme case, to an infinitely sized brain. The solution that must be employed is to capture only a small sample of the first order state. The key is to realize that effective meta management doesn't require access to everything, only to just enough information. So this sample will be a small selection of all state, and that too in a dimensionally reduced form. Evolutionary pressures will take care of the details. To illustrate this point, to consider the way that during deliberation, we have conscious awareness of the overall sequence of thoughts, but there are often steps in between where we sort of sit back and wait for the answer to arrive. I would suggest that the reason we aren't consciously aware of the details of those steps is that their processes are somehow sufficiently well organized that they always produce the right results without meta management. Perhaps, for example, it is something akin to the way that I can pick up my coffee without thinking about the details. The next problem is that some first order processes require significant amount of knowledge about the particular problem domain. Take chess, for example. There are many rules that need to be considered. In such cases, the second order process will need just as much domain knowledge. So that domain knowledge needs to be shared somehow. The third problem is in what mechanisms the meta management process uses to exert control over the first order process. Now, there are probably reasonable solutions to that, but I don't think the brain solves the problem this way because there is a simpler way. Counterintuitively, given the right tools, the first order process can meta manage itself. To explain that, let's dive into the first order process a little more. Here we have a first order process. It has a number of sensory inputs. It is deliberative in that it can cycle around considering things and hold state that represents its current partial result before producing some, say, motor action. Now, modern predictive theories suggest that the brain doesn't produce results via simple feed-forward mechanisms, but rather uses predictive processes, such as suggested by the theory of predictive coding. The brain models the causal structure of the world, its own body, and how its actions affect outcomes. And it uses all that to decide on the best action for a given situation. For those familiar, the theory of free energy minimization, otherwise known as active inference, provides a clear description for how such a system can operate effectively. Now notice that in such a system, the brain can identify a number of distinct independent structures. By taking note of what it can and cannot easily influence, it can develop a distinction between self versus other. And it can identify that certain body parts operate independently, effectively segmenting its conception of self into parts. Now we return to meta-management, and finally we come to the first punchline. We take that dimensionally reduced sample of first order state that we discussed earlier, and we make it available as a sensory input like any other. This creates what I call the cognitive sense. Through the same modeling and predictive mechanisms that we discussed earlier, the first order process is now able to choose the best actions to keep its own state on track, while simultaneously working to manage its body state and actions. So the actions that we are talking about here are now a combination of external and cognitive. Significantly, the first order process now observes itself. It sees itself, its own thoughts, if you will. And this fits with our experience of consciousness. We observe our own thoughts as they play out. I suggest that this basic idea of auto-meta management underpins much of human intelligence. I don't have time to discuss here, but it can be shown to support abstract thought, for example. More relevant to our interest today, it provides a framework for understanding many aspects of consciousness. If you consider that the predictive and modeling mechanisms already lead to separate models for self versus other, and for segmentation of body parts, it's easy to see how the brain now also develops a segmented model for its body versus mind. These are independent systems that need separate management strategies. Add to that our emotional affects, and I believe that you have a strong case for explaining all of the various contents of conscious experience, and perhaps even some of the more phenomenological aspects. To illustrate that last point, I shall briefly look at three examples of phenomenological characteristics of conscious experience. The focus or intention of consciousness is said to look through to first order perceptions and thoughts. This leads to questions of how and why it should do that, whether it somehow references the same intention of those first order perceptions or makes some sort of copy. MMT suggests that the intention of consciousness is the state and behavior of the cognitive process as it performs its duty. This means that conscious intent is not the same as those perceptions or thoughts, but rather is the result of the processing of those perceptions and thoughts. Secondly, there are long-standing debates about the causal power of consciousness. How does consciously being aware of something influence our behavior? Or is it epiphenomenal? MMT suggests that consciousness is what I call post-causal. Consciousness of a given moment in time is constructed after the fact. Thus, it has no causal power over that moment, but it has significant influence over the events that follow. Lastly, MMT clarifies that conscious access is limited to a high-level summary of the general goings-on within the cognitive process. More importantly, it is limited to those goings-on that require meta-management. Anything that can operate automatically without needing that higher order meta-management will be hidden from conscious experience. To summarize MMT, it proposes that the purpose of consciousness is for the meta-management of deliberative processing. It provides a direct answer to the so-called meta problem of consciousness, why it is that we can conclude that we are conscious, and it explains a number of important phenomenological characteristics of consciousness. In total, I believe that MMT, combined with other theories of self-modeling and intelligence, explains all aspects of the contents of conscious experience. I must grant, however, that it does not explain why all of that should be associated with phenomenological consciousness in the first place. Before wrapping up, I must briefly clarify how I think that MMT fits in with other computational theories. The way I look at it is that existing theories essentially start with consciousness and attempt to explain its high-level characteristics. Notice that most computational theories are simultaneously theories of intelligence or cognition more generally. MMT similarly is focused on intelligence, But in contrast to the others, it starts from the low-level needs of the organism and builds up towards consciousness. This is why I say that MMT provides context to those existing theories and provides a first principles foundation for them. I want to thank the conference organizers for giving me a chance to share this work, and I thank you to everyone for listening to this presentation. I'm currently working to get this work published, and I'm exploring more of what it can tell us about human intelligence. In the meantime, more detailed descriptions are available on my blog and my website. Now, before I finish, I have a small request. It's been lots of fun working on this as a hobby, but it's lonely hard work without the feedback that you would get from colleagues. And it's hard for me to judge whether others will think that there is merit in this work. So I'd absolutely love to hear your feedback, good or bad. If what I've presented is of interest to you, do please get in touch. I'm also very open to collaborating with others to see where this theory can lead. Thank you everyone for listening.